the dark photo that reveals the Ashford family's forgotten past. Dr. Linda Morrison had been hired to catalog the Ashford family estate for the Historical Society, but she never expected to find what lay hidden in the attic of their Boston mansion. The renowned historian specialized in American political families, and the Ashfords were Massachusetts royalty, a dynasty that had produced senators, ambassadors, and nearly a president. It was August 2023, and the last surviving Ashford sibling had recently passed away. The family agreed to donate certain materials to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, where Linda worked as chief archivist. She climbed the narrow stairs to the third-floor attic, dusty and stifling in the summer heat. Boxes were stacked everywhere, labeled with decades: 1920s correspondence, 1940s photographs, 1960s campaign materials. And Linda worked methodically, photographing and cataloging each item. Then she found a leather trunk pushed far into a corner, covered with a heavy blanket, as if deliberately hidden. Inside the trunk were photographs, dozens of them, all featuring the same young woman: formal portraits, candid beach shots, school pictures. The woman appeared in images from the 1920s and 1930s, always among the Ashford children. But Linda had studied the Ashford family extensively and had never seen this woman in any published family history. She found a formal family portrait from 1938. 11 people posed in an elegant room with luxurious curtains and refined furniture. Richard Ashford, the patriarch, sat center with his wife Catherine beside him. 9 children surrounded them, 5 daughters and 4 sons, all impeccably dressed in the style of the era. Linda's breath caught. She recognized most of the faces: Robert Ashford, who became a decorated war hero and senator; William Ashford, the Attorney General; Patricia, who married into European aristocracy. But one young woman, seated to her father's right, was unfamiliar. She appeared to be about 20 years old, with a shy, uncertain expression that contrasted with the confident poses of her siblings. Linda turned this photograph over, written in faded ink: Ashford Family, Christmas, 1938. Complete. Complete? But published Ashford genealogies listed only 8 children, not 9. Who was this missing daughter? Linda searched through more boxes frantically. She found letters, report cards, medical documents, all relating to someone named Eleanor Ashford. Birth certificate: Eleanor Marie Ashford, born March 15th, 1918. School records from elite private schools. Letters to her mother discussing piano lessons and French tutoring. Then, abruptly, the documentation stopped in 1941. No more photographs, no more letters, nothing. It was as if Eleanor Ashford had simply ceased to exist after age 23. Linda found one final item at the bottom of the trunk: a medical invoice from November 1941. The procedure listed made her blood run cold. Prefrontal leucotomy, $200. Below it, in different handwriting: Patient E. Ashford. Referring physician: Dr. James Watts. Consulting: Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman and Watts. Linda knew those names. They were the pioneers of lobotomy in America, performing thousands of the procedures in the 1940s and 1950s before the practice was widely recognized as barbaric. Eleanor Ashford had been lobotomized. Then she had been erased from family history. Linda sat back, her hands trembling as she held the 1938 photograph. This wasn't just a missing piece of Ashford family history. This was evidence of something dark, a young woman whose existence had been deliberately hidden, whose life had been stolen by a brutal medical procedure, all to protect a powerful family's reputation. She pulled out her phone and called her supervisor. "I found something," she said quietly. Something the Ashfords never wanted anyone to see. The investigation into Eleanor Ashford's forgotten life was about to begin. Linda spent the next week assembling everything she could find about the Ashford family's public image in the 1930s and 1940s. What she discovered was a carefully crafted narrative of American perfection, a story that had no room for imperfection or disability. Richard Ashford built his fortune in banking and real estate during the 1920s, surviving the Depression by strategic investments and ruthless business practices. By 1932, he had become one of Boston's wealthiest men, with ambitions far beyond business. He wanted political power, social prestige, and a legacy that would endure for generations. Catherine Ashford came from old Boston money. Her family traced its lineage to the Mayflower. She brought respectability and connections to Richard's nouveau riche fortune. Together, they created what newspapers called America's most promising family. The Ashford children were raised to be exceptional. The sons attended Harvard and Yale, excelling in academics and athletics. The daughters were educated at the finest finishing schools, trained in languages, music, and the social graces necessary for advantageous marriages. Every public appearance was orchestrated, every photograph carefully composed. Linda found dozens of newspaper articles from the 1930s featuring the Ashford family. Boston's royal family hosts charity gala. Young Ashfords excel in academic competition. Senators visit to Ashford Estate. The coverage was universally positive, portraying a family of intelligence, beauty, and civic responsibility. But Eleanor appeared in very few of these articles. When she did, the descriptions were brief and vague. A 1936 Society column mentioned the Ashford daughters attending a debutante ball, but didn't list Eleanor by name. A 1937 photograph showed the family at their Cape Cod estate. Eleanor was positioned at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by her sister. Linda contacted Dr. Harold Jennings, a medical historian at Boston University who specialized in the history of psychiatric treatment. She showed him Eleanor's medical invoice and the family photographs. "This fits a pattern I've seen before," Harold said, his expression grim. Wealthy families in the 1930s and 1940s were obsessed with eugenics and genetic perfection. Any child who showed signs of intellectual disability, mental illness, or behavioral problems was seen as a threat to the family's reputation and genetic legacy. "What kind of problems would have led to a lobotomy?" Linda asked. "In Eleanor's case, we'd need to see medical records. But based on the timing, 1941, when she was 23, I'd guess developmental disabilities, possibly intellectual impairment or behavioral issues that became more noticeable as she reached adulthood. Families often hid these children during childhood, then faced difficult decisions when they couldn't be hidden anymore." Harold pulled up historical documents on his computer. Freeman and Watts performed their first lobotomy in 1936. By 1941, they were promoting the procedure as a miracle cure for everything from schizophrenia to rebellious behavior in women. Wealthy families paid them enormous fees. $200 in 1941 would be about $4,000 today to fix family members who didn't fit the perfect image. Linda felt sick. They mutilated a young woman to protect their reputation. Yes, and it was legal, even considered progressive medicine at the time. The Ashfords would have been praised for seeking the most modern treatment available. Linda returned to the archives, now searching specifically for Eleanor. She found a few private letters between Catherine Ashford and her sister, never intended for public view. One from 1938 read, "Eleanor continues to struggle with her studies. The tutors say she tries hard but simply cannot grasp concepts her siblings master easily. Richard worries about her future. What marriage prospects does a slow girl have?" Another letter from 1940 was more troubling. "Eleanor's episodes have become more frequent. She grows agitated easily, sometimes violent with the staff. Richard insists we cannot send her to an institution. The scandal would be unbearable. We must find another solution." The solution came in November 1941. After the lobotomy, Eleanor disappeared from all family records. She was never mentioned in public again. Linda found one final clue, a property deed from 1942. Richard Ashford purchased a private estate in rural Vermont, transferring ownership to a trust managed by a psychiatric care facility. The deed specified that one resident would live there permanently, with all expenses paid by the Ashford family trust. Eleanor hadn't died. She had been hidden away, institutionalized for life after the lobotomy destroyed her personality and cognitive abilities. The perfect Ashford family image had been built on the erasure of their most vulnerable member. Linda needed to understand who Eleanor had been before the lobotomy. She contacted the historical societies of schools Eleanor attended, requesting any available records. What she found painted a picture of a girl who had struggled but had been loved, until that love proved insufficient against her father's ambition. Eleanor's elementary school records from the prestigious Windsor School showed a student who worked diligently but fell behind academically. A 1928 teacher's note read, "Eleanor is a sweet, gentle child with a kind disposition. She struggles with mathematics and reading comprehension, but shows talent in music and art. She requires extra time and patience." By middle school, the gap between Eleanor and her siblings had widened significantly. While her brothers and sisters earned top marks, Eleanor barely passed. A 1932 report card showed C's and D's across all subjects except music, where she earned an A. Linda found a heartbreaking letter from Eleanor to her mother, dated 1933, when Eleanor was 15. "Dear Mother, I'm trying my very best at school, but the work is so hard. Miss Peterson says I'm not trying hard enough, but I am. Truly I am. Patricia says I am stupid and that Father is ashamed of me. Please tell me you're not ashamed. I love you. Eleanor?" Catherine's response, preserved in the archives, was brief. "Dearest Eleanor, your father and I love you always. But you must try harder. The Ashford name requires excellence. We cannot accept less from any of our children." Linda interviewed Margaret Sullivan, 94 years old, who had been a housemaid at the Ashford estate from 1935 to 1943. Margaret's memories of Eleanor were vivid and painful. "Eleanor was the sweetest of all those children," Margaret said, sitting in her assisted living apartment. "She wasn't like the others. They were all so sharp, so clever with words. Eleanor was slower, gentler. She'd spend hours in the music room playing piano, the same simple pieces, over and over. She loved the garden, loved animals. She'd talk to the dogs like they were people. Did the family treat her differently? Linda asked. Margaret's face darkened. Mr. Ashford barely acknowledged her. He'd introduce his children to visitors. This is Robert, headed to Harvard. This is William, top of his class. This is Kathleen, fluent in 3 languages. But he'd skip over Eleanor, or just say "and Eleanor" without any accomplishments listed. You could see it hurt her, the way her face would fall. What about her mother? Mrs. Ashford loved Eleanor, I think, but she loved her husband's approval more. She'd scold Eleanor constantly. "Sit up straight, don't fidget, speak clearly." Nothing Eleanor did was ever good enough. The girl tried so hard to please them. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. As Eleanor got older, things got worse. She'd have these episodes, I guess you'd call them. She'd get frustrated when she couldn't understand something, and she'd cry or sometimes throw things. Not violent, just overwhelmed. But Mr. Ashford saw it as embarrassing behavior that needed to be controlled. Linda showed Margaret the 1938 family photograph. This was taken about 3 years before the lobotomy. Margaret studied it carefully. Look at Eleanor's face. See how she's sitting? She's trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. The others are all confident, looking straight at the camera. Eleanor's turned slightly away, like she's hoping no one will see her. That's how she lived, trying to disappear. Linda found more evidence of Eleanor's struggles in private family correspondence. A 1939 letter from Richard to his brother mentioned the Eleanor problem explicitly. She is 21 now and cannot be hidden much longer. Society expects her to debut, to marry, to contribute to the family's standing, but she is incapable of any of this. Catherine insists we cannot institutionalize her. The stigma would be crushing. We need a solution that allows her to remain technically at home while ceasing to be a burden or embarrassment. That solution was lobotomy, a procedure that would leave Eleanor docile, manageable, and unable to embarrass the family with her limitations. The evidence was mounting. Eleanor had been a vulnerable young woman with developmental disabilities, struggling to meet impossible expectations, ultimately sacrificed to preserve her family's perfect public image. Linda's investigation now focused on the months leading up to November 1941, when Eleanor's life was forever destroyed. What she discovered showed a family making a calculated decision to eliminate their problem through radical surgery. She found correspondence between Richard Ashford and Dr. James Watts, one of the 2 physicians who pioneered lobotomy in America. The first letter, dated March 1941, was chillingly clinical. Dear Dr. Watts, I write regarding my daughter Eleanor, age 23, who suffers from intellectual deficiency and increasing behavioral difficulties. I have read with interest your published papers on prefrontal leucotomy as treatment for various mental conditions. I would like to discuss whether Eleanor might be a suitable candidate for this procedure. Dr. Watts responded enthusiastically. Linda found his reply in the archives. Dear Mr. Ashford, I would be pleased to evaluate your daughter. We have had remarkable success treating cases similar to what you describe. The procedure is brief, recovery is quick, and results are generally quite satisfactory. Patients become more manageable and their distressing symptoms are eliminated. What Watts didn't mention, what Linda knew from medical history, was that manageable meant emotionally blunted, intellectually diminished, and often completely incapacitated. Lobotomy didn't cure anything. It destroyed the parts of the brain responsible for personality, emotion, and complex thought. Linda contacted Dr. Patricia Brennan, a neurologist and medical ethicist at Massachusetts General Hospital. She showed her the correspondence and asked for context. This is horrifying, but not unusual for the era, Patricia explained. In the 1940s, lobotomy was promoted as a miracle cure. Freeman and Watts performed thousands of procedures on people diagnosed with everything from schizophrenia to depression to simple disobedience, especially in women. Families were told their troublesome relatives would become calm and cooperative. What they weren't told was that those people would lose their essential humanity. How was the procedure performed? Linda asked. Patricia pulled up historical medical illustrations. In 1941, it was surgical lobotomy, drilling holes in the skull and severing connections in the frontal lobe. Later, Freeman developed the transorbital lobotomy, inserting an ice pick-like instrument through the eye socket. Both methods destroyed brain tissue responsible for personality, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Linda found Eleanor's preoperative evaluation, written by Dr. Watts, in October 1941. It described her as a young woman of limited intelligence with episodes of emotional instability and oppositional behavior. Patient shows affection for family members, but becomes frustrated when unable to complete tasks. Occasionally displays tantrums when corrected. Recommend prefrontal leucotomy to reduce emotional reactivity and increase manageability. The tantrums were a young woman's understandable frustration at being constantly criticized for limitations she couldn't control. The oppositional behavior was probably her attempting to assert basic autonomy. None of it warranted brain surgery. Linda found Catherine Ashford's diary entry from November 1941, written the day before Eleanor's lobotomy. Tomorrow we take Eleanor to the hospital. Richard assures me this is for the best, that the doctors are the finest in the country, that Eleanor will be happier afterward, calm and content instead of anxious and struggling. But my heart is heavy. She is my daughter. I remember her as a baby, so sweet and gentle. Am I betraying her by allowing this? Richard says I must think of the other children, of the family's future. Eleanor's condition threatens everything we've built. This is the only solution. God forgive me if I am wrong. The lobotomy was performed November 12, 1941, at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. The procedure took less than an hour. The invoice listed the fee, $200, and noted, "Procedure completed successfully. Patient transferred to recovery, family notified." Linda found one more document, a letter from Dr. Watts to Richard Ashford, written 2 weeks after the surgery. "Dear Mr. Ashford, I'm pleased to report that Eleanor's recovery is proceeding as expected. She is docile and cooperative, showing none of her previous emotional outbursts. As anticipated, there is some reduction in initiative and spontaneity, but this should be acceptable, given the elimination of her problematic behaviors. She will require long-term supervision, but should no longer present the difficulties you previously described." A reduction in initiative and spontaneity was medical euphemism for the destruction of Eleanor's personality. She had been reduced to a manageable shell of herself. The Ashford family had purchased their perfect image at the cost of their daughter's humanity. Linda needed to understand what happened to Eleanor after the lobotomy destroyed her cognitive abilities and personality. The trail led to a private psychiatric facility in Vermont, where Eleanor spent the remaining 64 years of her life in obscurity. She contacted Meadowbrook Estates, which still operated as a long-term care facility. The director, James Patterson, was initially hesitant to discuss historical patients, but when Linda explained she was documenting the Ashford family history for the Kennedy Library, he agreed to share non-confidential information. "We have records going back to our founding in 1924, James said over a video call. "I can confirm that a resident matching your description was admitted in December 1941 and remained here until her death in 2005. Linda's throat tightened. 2005? Eleanor lived until 2005? "Yes. She was 87 when she died. She spent 64 years here." Linda did the math. Eleanor had lived through World War II, the Kennedy assassinations, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, all of it experienced from inside an institution, her mind destroyed by a procedure her father authorized. James continued, "Our records show she was a lobotomy patient, which was noted specifically because by the 1970s we stopped accepting such patients as attitudes toward the procedure changed. Her care was fully paid for by a family trust that still makes payments to this day. Can you tell me anything about her life here? What was she like?" James consulted his files. The early records describe her as docile and compliant, showing little initiative or emotional response. She required assistance with all daily activities. She could walk and feed herself, but needed prompting for basic tasks. She rarely spoke and showed minimal recognition of people or events. Linda felt tears welling. This was what the Ashford family had done to their daughter, reduced her to a barely functioning shell, then hidden her away for life. "Did anyone visit her?" Linda asked. "That's interesting, actually. For the first 20 years, there are no recorded visits at all. Then, starting in 1961, someone began visiting regularly, every few months. The visitor logs show R. Ashford signing in. Robert Ashford, Eleanor's younger brother, who became a decorated Navy officer and later a senator. He had found his sister and visited her. Linda located Robert's personal papers at the Kennedy Library. Among them was a diary entry from June 1961. Finally found Eleanor today. Took me months to track down where father had hidden her. Seeing her was the hardest thing I've ever done. She's 43 years old, but seems ancient, blank. She looked at me without recognition. I told her I was her brother, that I loved her, that I was sorry. She smiled vaguely, but I don't think she understood. What did we do to her? What did father do? I can never forgive this." Another entry from 1963, shortly after Robert lost his Senate bid. "Visited Eleanor today. Sometimes I tell her about my life, even though I don't think she understands. I told her about the campaign, about losing. Told her maybe it's justice. Maybe the Ashford family doesn't deserve power after what we did to her. She just sat there, that empty smile on her face. I'm the only one who visits. The others have completely forgotten her, or maybe they choose not to remember." Linda found more diary entries spanning decades. Robert visited Eleanor at least 3 times a year until his death in 1998. He brought her books, music recordings, flowers, gifts she probably couldn't appreciate, but that seemed to ease his guilt. A 1982 entry was particularly poignant. "Eleanor is 64 now. I'm 61. We're both old. I look at her and try to remember the girl she was before the lobotomy. I have a few memories. Her playing piano, her gentleness with animals, her sweet smile. But mostly, I remember Father's shame, Mother's worry, all of us pretending she didn't exist. Then, one day, she was gone, and when she came back at Christmas 1942, she wasn't Eleanor anymore. She was a ghost. We made her a ghost to save ourselves embarrassment. I will carry this shame until I die. Linda contacted the Vermont facility again and asked about Eleanor's final years. By the 1990s, she required full nursing care, James explained. She developed dementia in addition to the cognitive impairment from the lobotomy. She died peacefully in 2005, with Mr. Ashford present. Robert was with her when she died. Yes, he'd been in declining health himself, but insisted on being notified if her condition worsened. He was holding her hand when she passed. Eleanor was buried in a private cemetery in Vermont. Her grave marked simply, Eleanor Marie Ashford, 1918-2005. No mention of her family's prominence, no recognition of the injustice done to her. Just a name and dates marking a life stolen and hidden. The perfect Ashford family had hidden their imperfect daughter for 64 years, and only one of them had cared enough to remember. Linda now investigated why Eleanor's siblings, except Robert, had completely erased her from their lives. What she discovered revealed a family conspiracy of silence that lasted generations. She found a remarkable document. Minutes from a family meeting held in January 1942, 2 months after Eleanor's lobotomy. All 8 surviving Ashford children attended, along with Richard and Catherine. The meeting was documented by the family lawyer, presumably to create a legal record of decisions made. The minutes were chilling in their clinical detachment. Meeting convened at the Ashford residence, Boston, January 15, 1942. Present: Richard and Catherine Ashford, and children Robert, age 24, William, age 23, Kathleen, age 22, Patricia, age 20, Edward, age 18, Thomas, age 16, Jean, age 14, and Margaret, age 12. Subject: family matters regarding Eleanor. Richard's statement, recorded verbatim, laid out the family's official position. Eleanor has been placed in a private facility where she will receive excellent care for the remainder of her life. The procedure she underwent was necessary for her own well-being and peace of mind. However, given the sensitive nature of her condition and treatment, we have decided as a family that Eleanor's situation will not be discussed publicly. When asked about family composition, we will refer to our 8 children. Eleanor's name will not appear in any public family documents or photographs going forward. This is not to diminish Eleanor, but to protect her privacy and dignity. The lawyer's notes indicated that all siblings agreed to this decision, though Robert's agreement was marked with an asterisk, and the notation, R. Ashford expressed reservations, but will comply with family decision. Linda found evidence that this conspiracy of silence was rigorously enforced. When Kathleen published a memoir in 1968 titled Growing Up Ashford, Eleanor was completely absent. The book described growing up as one of 8 children in a prominent Boston family, detailing elaborate family vacations, educational experiences, and social events. Eleanor appeared in none of these stories. Patricia, interviewed for a Society magazine in 1975, discussed my 7 siblings and described family dinners where all 8 of us children gathered around the table. Eleanor had been erased so completely that Patricia didn't even have to consciously lie. She had simply rewritten her own history to exclude her inconvenient sister. Linda contacted several Ashford grandchildren, the next generation, who might have knowledge of Eleanor. Most had never heard of her. One, Richard Ashford III, Robert's son, age 68, agreed to an interview. I never knew about Eleanor until I was in my 30s, Richard told Linda over the phone. Dad mentioned her once, after he'd been drinking. He said he had a sister who'd been taken away when he was young, that terrible things had been done to her, that the family had agreed to forget her. I pressed him for details, but he wouldn't say more. He was crying. I'd never seen my father cry before. Did you investigate further? Linda asked. I tried. I asked my aunts and uncles, Dad's siblings. They either claimed not to know what I was talking about or changed the subject immediately. My Aunt Patricia told me I was mistaken, that Dad only ever had 7 siblings. It was like they collectively decided Eleanor never existed, and they were sticking to that story no matter what. Richard continued. Eventually, Dad told me the whole truth, showed me a few photographs he'd kept hidden, explained about the lobotomy, the institutionalization, how the family had erased her to protect their reputation. He was tormented by guilt his entire life. He visited her regularly, but never told anyone else in the family. He said they'd made a pact of silence, and he was the only one who broke it. Linda found evidence that Robert had tried, near the end of his life, to bring Eleanor back into family history. In 1997, he wrote to his siblings suggesting that Eleanor be included in a family tree being prepared for the Ashford Foundation's archives. The responses were uniformly negative. William, by then a retired federal judge, wrote back, Robert, we discussed this matter 50 years ago and reached a decision. Eleanor's situation was tragic, but dredging it up now serves no purpose except to create scandal and pain. Our parents made the best decision they could, given the circumstances and medical knowledge of the time. Let the past remain past. Kathleen's response was even more direct. Absolutely not. Eleanor was troubled and received treatment. That's all anyone needs to know. Including her in family histories would only raise questions we cannot answer and should not have to answer. The family has thrived because we maintained our dignity and privacy. Eleanor's condition was a private matter then and should remain so now. Only Margaret, the youngest sibling, expressed any sympathy. Robert, I was only 12 when Eleanor went away. I barely remember her. Just vague impressions of a quiet, sad older sister who seemed out of place in our loud, competitive family. Maybe you're right that we should acknowledge her. But I don't have the courage to fight the others on this. I'm sorry. Robert's final diary entry about Eleanor, written in 1998, shortly before his death, reflected his resignation and continued guilt. I tried one last time to bring Eleanor back into our family story. My siblings refused, just as I knew they would. They've lived their entire lives pretending she never existed, and they'll die maintaining that fiction. I am the only one who remembers, the only one who visits, the only one who cares. When I die, Eleanor will be forgotten completely. Unless someone finds these papers and tells her story, she will disappear from history as if she never lived. That seems the cruelest fate of all. Linda realized she was that someone. She had found Robert's papers and Eleanor's story. She had the power to restore Eleanor to history, to break the decades of silence the Ashford family had maintained. The question was, should she? Linda needed expert context on lobotomy to fully understand what had been done to Eleanor. She contacted Dr. Elliot Wallenstein, a neurologist and historian who had written extensively about the lobotomy era in American medicine. Dr. Wallenstein agreed to review Eleanor's medical documents and provide historical analysis. They met at his office at MIT, where he had assembled materials documenting the rise and fall of lobotomy in America. Lobotomy is one of the darkest chapters in medical history, Elliot began, precisely because it was promoted as progressive, scientific treatment by respected physicians and enthusiastically adopted by wealthy, educated families. The Ashfords weren't ignorant or cruel by the standards of their time. They were following what was considered cutting-edge medical advice. He pulled up photographs of Walter Freeman and James Watts, the two doctors who performed Eleanor's procedure. Freeman was a brilliant self-promoter who genuinely believed lobotomy would revolutionize psychiatry. Watts was a more cautious neurosurgeon who performed the actual operations. Together, they promoted lobotomy as a cure for virtually every mental condition. Elliot showed Linda medical journals from the 1940s with titles like Psychosurgery, a New Treatment for Mental Disease, and Successful Management of Difficult Patients Through Prefrontal Leucotomy. The articles described lobotomy in glowing terms, with before and after photographs showing agitated patients who became calm and compliant after surgery. What they didn't show, Elliot explained, were the devastating long-term effects. Patients lost their ability to plan, to feel complex emotions, to form meaningful relationships. Many became incontinent, unable to care for themselves. Some died from complications. The procedure essentially destroyed what made people human while leaving their bodies alive. How many people underwent lobotomy? Linda asked. Estimates vary, but between 1936 and 1967, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 Americans were lobotomized. Many were women diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or simply being difficult or disobedient. Many were people with developmental disabilities, like Eleanor. Families saw lobotomy as a way to make inconvenient relatives manageable. Elliot examined Eleanor's pre-operative evaluation. Look at the justifications here. Limited intelligence, emotional instability, oppositional behavior. These are not symptoms of mental illness requiring brain surgery. These are descriptions of a woman with developmental disabilities who struggled to meet her family's expectations. He continued, in the 1940s, there was enormous stigma around any kind of cognitive impairment. Wealthy families especially couldn't tolerate having a child who wasn't perfect. They faced a choice. Institutionalize the child in a state hospital, which carried huge stigma, or try this new miracle procedure that promised to make the child manageable while keeping them nominally at home. But Eleanor was institutionalized anyway, Linda noted. Yes, because lobotomy didn't work as promised. It didn't make people better, it made them worse. But by then the damage was permanent. Eleanor couldn't be restored to her pre-lobotomy state, limited as that was. Her family had destroyed her brain's capacity for personality and emotion, leaving them with someone who required even more care than before. Elliot showed Linda a graph tracking lobotomy procedures over time. Notice the peak is 1949 through 1952, thousands of procedures per year. Then, a sharp decline starting in the mid-1950s, as psychiatrists began to recognize the procedure was harmful. By the 1960s, it was considered barbaric. But tens of thousands of people, like Eleanor, were already living with destroyed brains. Why wasn't anyone held accountable? Linda asked. Why weren't Freeman and Watts prosecuted? Because it wasn't considered a crime. They were licensed physicians performing a legal procedure with patient consent, or in cases like Eleanor's, family consent. There was no framework for recognizing what they did as medical malpractice or human rights violations. Freeman continued performing lobotomies into the 1960s, even after most hospitals banned the procedure. He was finally stopped only when a patient died during surgery. Elliot pulled up one more document, a statement from the World Health Organization in 1977 that condemned lobotomy as a violation of human rights and called for its complete cessation. By then, Eleanor had been living with a destroyed brain for 36 years. This formal recognition that what was done to her was wrong came far too late. Linda looked at Eleanor's 1938 photograph again, the shy, gentle young woman seated beside her father, trying to make herself small and unnoticeable. Within 3 years, her personality would be surgically destroyed to preserve her family's perfect image. What happened to Eleanor was legal medical torture, Linda said quietly. Yes, Elliot agreed, and it happened to tens of thousands of people just like her, most of whose stories will never be told because their families erased them as thoroughly as the Ashfords erased Eleanor. Linda knew she had to tell Eleanor's story, no matter how painful or controversial. It was the only way to give Eleanor back the humanity her family had stolen from her. Linda's discovery of Eleanor's story had generated intense interest at the Kennedy Library and beyond, but it also raised difficult ethical questions. Did she have the right to expose a family's dark secret? What responsibility did she have to living Ashford descendants? And what would be achieved by making Eleanor's tragedy public? She convened a meeting with the library's ethics board, consisting of historians, archivists, and bioethicists. The discussion was contentious from the beginning. Dr. Thomas Richardson, a medical ethicist from Harvard, argued strongly for publication. Eleanor Ashford's story represents a historical injustice that should be documented and remembered. She was a victim of both medical malpractice and family abuse. Hiding her story perpetuates the very erasure that victimized her initially. We owe it to Eleanor and to thousands of other lobotomy victims to tell this story. But Professor Janet Caldwell, a historian specializing in ethics and privacy, raised concerns. We're talking about exposing private medical information and deeply embarrassing family secrets. Some Ashford descendants are still alive. They didn't authorize the lobotomy. They weren't even born when it happened. Is it fair to subject them to public scrutiny and shame for their grandparents' decisions? Linda had wrestled with these questions herself. She shared her perspective. I've interviewed several Ashford descendants. Most never knew Eleanor existed. They're shocked and horrified by what their family did. Some support telling the story. They feel Eleanor deserves recognition. Others are terrified of public scandal. But here's what I keep coming back to. Eleanor had no choice in what was done to her. She had no voice in her own life. Someone has to speak for her now. The board reviewed relevant legal and ethical frameworks. Under archival ethics guidelines, Linda had the right to publish information from donated materials unless specifically restricted by the donors. The Ashford estate had placed no restrictions on the materials, probably because they didn't know the Eleanor documents existed in that attic trunk. Attorney Michael Jong addressed the legal concerns. There's no legal barrier to publication. Eleanor is deceased. The events occurred over 80 years ago. All the principals, Richard and Catherine Ashford, the doctors who performed the lobotomy, are long dead. Living descendants have no legal standing to prevent publication of historical documents. But should we publish just because we can? Janet pressed. What's the purpose? Who benefits? Linda had prepared for this question. I've researched the history of lobotomy extensively now. There are very few detailed case studies of individual victims. Most lobotomy patients disappeared from history, just like Eleanor did. Their families hid them, and no records survived. Eleanor's story is unusually well documented because of her family's prominence and their compulsive record-keeping. This is a rare opportunity to put a face and a name to a historical atrocity, to show the human cost of a medical procedure that destroyed tens of thousands of lives. She continued, Moreover, Eleanor's story reveals something important about how wealthy, powerful families operated in the mid-20th century. The Ashfords represented themselves as paragons of American virtue, public service, philanthropy, moral leadership. But privately, they tortured their own daughter to maintain that image. That hypocrisy deserves exposure. Dr. Richardson added, There's also educational value. Most Americans today have never heard of lobotomy. They don't know this happened. Eleanor's story, because it involves a prominent family, will reach a wide audience and educate people about this dark chapter of medical history. The board debated for hours. Finally, they reached a consensus. Linda could proceed with publication, but with specific ethical guardrails. She would focus on Eleanor as an individual and victim, not sensationalize family scandal. She would offer living descendants an opportunity to comment or provide context. She would work with mental health advocates to ensure the story promoted understanding of disability rather than stigmatizing it. Linda contacted Richard Ashford III, Robert's son, who had been the most open about Eleanor during their previous conversation. She explained her plans and asked for his perspective. "I think you should tell the story," Richard said after a long pause. "My father visited Eleanor for nearly 40 years. He felt tremendous guilt about what the family did to her. Near the end of his life, he told me he wished he'd spoken up, wished he'd broken the silence earlier. He said Eleanor deserved to be remembered as a real person, not erased like she never existed. Some of your relatives may not feel the same way," Linda cautioned. "I know. Some will be furious. They'll see this as betrayal, as airing family dirty laundry. But here's the thing. Eleanor was a person. She had a life, even if it was taken from her. She deserves to have her story told. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe they should be uncomfortable. Maybe we all should be uncomfortable knowing this is what our family did." Linda spent the next month preparing her article. She titled it, "The Forgotten Ashford, How One Family Erased Their Disabled Daughter." It would be published in American Heritage magazine and accompanied by an exhibit at the Kennedy Library featuring Eleanor's photographs, letters, and medical documents. The story would finally give Eleanor what her family had denied her: recognition, dignity, and a place in history. The American Heritage article was published in November 2024. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, the story went viral on social media. News outlets picked it up. By the next morning, Eleanor Ashford's photograph, the 1938 family portrait with her seated beside her father, was everywhere. Linda's phone rang constantly. Interview requests from NPR, CNN, The New York Times. Documentary filmmakers wanting to tell Eleanor's story. Disability rights organizations praising the article for highlighting historical injustices against people with disabilities, and angry calls from some Ashford family members. Patricia Ashford, Eleanor's youngest surviving sister at age 94, released a statement through her attorney. "The publication of private family medical information is unconscionable. Eleanor's condition was addressed with the best medical treatment available at the time. Our parents made difficult decisions out of love and concern for Eleanor's well-being. This publicity serves no purpose except to sensationalize family tragedy for profit." But other responses were more supportive. The National Alliance on Mental Illness issued a statement praising the article. Eleanor Ashford's story reminds us that people with disabilities and mental health conditions have historically been subjected to horrific abuses, often by their own families. These stories must be told so we never forget and never repeat these injustices. Disability rights activist Jennifer Harris wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "Eleanor Ashford is Every Disabled Person's Nightmare." What happened to Eleanor could have happened to any of us in 1941. She was deemed imperfect by her family's standards, so they eliminated her personality, hid her away, and pretended she never existed. Every disabled person fears this, being seen as a burden, an embarrassment, something to be fixed or hidden. Eleanor's story is a warning about what happens when perfection is valued above humanity. Linda appeared on PBS NewsHour to discuss the historical context. The host asked her why Eleanor's story mattered now, over 80 years after the lobotomy. "Because the impulse that led to Eleanor's lobotomy still exists," Linda answered. "We live in a society that values perfection, that sees disability as something to be eliminated rather than accommodated. We have prenatal testing that allows parents to abort fetuses with Down syndrome. We have genetic engineering that promises to eliminate defective genes. The technology has changed, but the underlying question remains, do we value human beings who don't fit our definition of perfect?" Eleanor's story says we didn't in 1941, and it challenges us to ask if we truly do now. The Kennedy Library opened its Eleanor Ashford exhibit in December 2024. Hundreds of people attended the opening, including several Ashford descendants. The exhibit featured the 1938 family photograph prominently, alongside Eleanor's childhood artwork, her school papers, letters between her and her mother, and the devastating medical documents authorizing her lobotomy. One wall displayed quotes from Robert Ashford's diary, including his 1998 reflection, "When I die, Eleanor will be forgotten completely. Unless someone finds these papers and tells her story, she will disappear from history as if she never lived." Richard Ashford III attended the opening and stood before that quote for a long time. "Dad would be glad this happened," he told Linda. "He spent 40 years trying to atone for what the family did. This exhibit, your article, this is his vindication. Eleanor is finally being remembered." But the most powerful moment came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Chen, a 78-year-old woman from California, contacted the library after seeing news coverage of the exhibit. She asked to speak with Linda urgently. They connected by video call. Dorothy was weeping as she explained, "I'm a lobotomy survivor. I was lobotomized in 1963 when I was 17 years old. My parents said I was too rebellious, too disobedient. The doctor said lobotomy would make me calmer, more compliant. I've lived for 61 years with the damage they did to my brain. I have emotional blunting, difficulty planning and organizing, problems with impulse control. I can function, but I'm not whole. I've never told anyone except my husband and children. Why are you telling me now? Linda asked gently. Because of Eleanor. Because someone finally told the story. For 61 years, I've carried shame about what was done to me, like it was my fault for being difficult. But seeing Eleanor's story, seeing it called what it was, abuse, medical torture, it's the first time I felt like maybe I was the victim, not the problem. Dorothy continued, there are others like me, people who survived lobotomy and have lived quietly with the damage for decades. Eleanor's story is giving us permission to speak, to acknowledge what was done to us. Thank you for telling her story. You've given voice to all of us who had our voices taken away. Linda realized the impact of Eleanor's story extended far beyond one forgotten woman. It was opening conversations about medical ethics, family responsibility, disability rights, and the definition of human worth. Eleanor, who had been erased from history, was now sparking dialogue that could help others. The dark secret the Ashford family had buried for 83 years was now illuminating present-day issues. 6 months after the article's publication, Linda stood at Eleanor's grave in Vermont. It was a sunny May morning in 2025, and the small cemetery was peaceful. Eleanor's simple headstone, Eleanor Marie Ashford, 1918-2005, would soon be replaced by a new one. The Ashford family, after intense internal debate, had agreed to install a new memorial. The inscription would read, Eleanor Marie Ashford, 1918-2005, daughter-sister, victim of medical injustice, erased by her family, forgotten by history, now remembered with love and sorrow. May her story ensure such injustice never happens again. Richard Ashford III had championed the new memorial, arguing that his father Robert's decades of visits deserved recognition and that Eleanor deserved acknowledgement of what had been done to her. Several cousins supported him. Others boycotted the memorial service, still maintaining that airing family tragedy was shameful. About 30 people attended the memorial service. Ashford descendants, historians, disability rights activists, and several lobotomy survivors who had come forward after Eleanor's story was published. A local minister who had never met Eleanor conducted the service, basing his remarks on the documents and photographs Linda had discovered. Eleanor Ashford lived 2 lives, the minister said. The first 23 years, she was a young woman who loved music and animals, who struggled with expectations she couldn't meet, who tried desperately to please a family that saw her as defective. Then, in November 1941, that life ended. She lived another 64 years after lobotomy, but she was no longer Eleanor. She was a shell, warehoused in an institution, visited only by one brother who never forgot her. He continued, We're here today to do what should have been done 84 years ago, to say that Eleanor Ashford mattered. Her life had value. What was done to her was wrong, and we're here to promise that we will not forget her again. Dorothy Chen, the lobotomy survivor who had contacted Linda, spoke next. I never met Eleanor, but I feel like I know her, because what happened to her almost happened to me. The only difference is that I survived with enough of my mind intact to tell my story. Eleanor couldn't tell hers, so we must tell it for her. We must make sure the world knows what was done to people like us, people who were deemed inconvenient or imperfect and were tortured in the name of medicine and family reputation. Linda was asked to speak last. She looked at the small gathering and felt the weight of responsibility. Eleanor's story had touched thousands of people through the article and exhibit, but these were the people who had come to actually remember her, to stand at her grave and acknowledge her humanity. When I found Eleanor's photograph in that attic, Linda began, I had no idea where it would lead. I certainly didn't imagine standing here at her grave, speaking about a woman I never met, but have come to deeply care about. Eleanor's story has changed me. It's changed how I think about history, about family, about what we owe to people society deems less valuable. She continued, Eleanor Ashford was lobotomized because she didn't fit her family's definition of perfection. She was hidden away because acknowledging her existence might have damaged their reputation. For 83 years, that erasure worked. No one knew about Eleanor. She disappeared from history as completely as if she'd never been born. But now we know. Now Eleanor's story has been told. And because of that, conversations are happening. People are talking about the history of lobotomy, about medical ethics, about how we treat people with disabilities. Survivors are coming forward to share their experiences. Families are confronting difficult truths about their own histories. Linda looked at the old headstone, soon to be replaced. Eleanor can't know we're here. She died without knowing that anyone beyond her brother Robert would remember her. But we're here anyway, because Eleanor's life mattered, her suffering mattered, and her story matters. not despite being dark and painful, but because it's dark and painful. These are the stories we most need to tell and remember. After the service, people placed flowers at Eleanor's grave. Someone left a small stuffed dog, remembering the detail from the housemaid's testimony that Eleanor had loved animals. Richard Ashford III placed a photograph at the grave, the 1938 family portrait, the one that had started Linda's investigation. As the gathering dispersed, Linda stayed behind. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph of Eleanor's grave surrounded by flowers and mementos. Tomorrow, this image would be added to the exhibit at the Kennedy Library. The forgotten Ashford daughter had finally been remembered. Her dark story had been brought into light. And while nothing could undo the injustice done to Eleanor, telling her story might prevent such injustices in the future. Linda thought of Robert Ashford's final diary entry, his fear that Eleanor would disappear from history completely. He had been wrong. Eleanor's story survived because he preserved it, because he visited her for 40 years, because he felt guilty enough to document the truth in his private papers. And now, Eleanor's legacy was assured. The photo that revealed the Ashford family's dark secret had become a symbol of historical injustice, medical ethics, disability rights, and the importance of remembering the people society tries to forget. Eleanor Marie Ashford, born 1918, lobotomized 1941, died 2005, would never be forgotten again. As Linda walked back to her car, she looked back one more time at the grave surrounded by flowers. In the 1938 photograph, Eleanor had been trying to make herself invisible, shrinking away from the camera. Now, finally she was seen. The dark past had been revealed. The forgotten daughter had been remembered. And Eleanor's story would ensure that she and thousands like her would never be erased from history again.